Hello there and welcome to the Love Means More podcast, a production of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, asking some important questions about the call to love. I'm your host, Andrew Bonapane, and today we're discussing the fight against pornography. Later in the episode, we'll cover the Supreme Court's recent decision that allowed states to protect children from internet porn. But first, let's meet our guests. Clare Morell is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where she directs EPPC's Technology and Human Flourishing Project. Prior to joining EPPC, Ms. Morell worked in both the White House Counsel's Office and the Department of Justice. She is also the author of The Tech Exit, a practical guide to freeing kids and teens from smartphones, which was just published by Penguin Random House. Clare, congratulations on the book and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And my other guest is Father Alan Hoffa, who is pastor of Holy Guardian Angels Parish in the Diocese of Allentown. During Father Hoffa's priestly ministry, he has served as parochial vicar, high school chaplain, college chaplain at Lehigh University, director of the Diocesan Office for Youth and Young Adult Ministry, and Catholic youth event speaker and worship leader. Father Hoffa has been involved with Integrity Restored since 2016, and in February 2017, Father Hoffa was appointed by his bishop, Bishop Alfred Schlert, to lead the Integrity Restored initiative in the Diocese of Allentown. To prepare for this ministry, Father Hoffa was trained through the Integrity Restored Priest Intensive to assist those struggling with pornography in their lives. Since that time, Father Hoffa has worked with his bishop to develop a diocesan plan to address pornography for the faithful of his diocese at every level. This work has resulted in the Lumen Christi Commission in the Diocese of Allentown, dedicated to bringing the faithful out of the darkness of pornography and back to the bright light found in Jesus Christ. Father Hoffa speaks on the subject to audiences ranging from priests to young people. Father Hoffa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
The USCCB released a 10th anniversary edition of its pastoral response to pornography titled Create in Me a Pure Heart, which you can read online and order in print like this at the link in the description. The preface for 2025 has a lot of recommendations for parents, for educators, clergy, and civil leaders to help them protect against the ongoing scourge of pornography. One of those recommendations for civil leaders has to do with age verification requirements for pornographic websites, which just happens to intersect with a Supreme Court case that was just decided last week, known as Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. In that decision, the Supreme Court upheld a Texas law that required porn websites to verify that its users were adults before accessing their harmful content. In support of this and similar age verification laws, the USCCB submitted an amicus curiae brief in that case, and Bishop Robert Barron actually just published an op-ed in our Sunday Visitor just a couple days ago, welcoming that decision and addressing a couple of other Supreme Court decisions and calling for age verification and protecting kids online. Clare, can you tell us a bit about the core dispute in the FSC versus Paxton case's oral arguments?
Yeah, so the petitioners, which is the Free Speech Coalition, and I just like to explain for people because I think Free Speech Coalition, you might think, okay, these are just some nonprofit free speech groups. It is the big porn industry.
Right.
Literally the trade association for the biggest pornography websites, Pornhub, X-Hamster, I don't even know all the names, but those were the parties in the case. So even Justice Alito picked up on that in his questioning. He was like, just to clarify, who you're representing here is just major pornography websites, and they said yes.
It's not as if there are other free speech concerns unrelated to pornography that the Free Speech Coalition is trying to
No, they're not advocating
safeguard.
for anything.
Yeah.
No, exactly. So the petitioner's arguments was mainly twofold, that the age verification law in Texas was going to restrict adults' rights to speech and privacy, and the other argument they were making is that there's actually a less restrictive means to fulfill the compelling state interest in protecting kids from obscenity, which are filters. But the other side response and the amicus briefs filed on the other side clearly show filters have not been effective. And in fact, the petitioners in their arguments really gave no evidence to prove filters' effectiveness. So they had no data backing that statement up. And then the second part about protecting adults' right to speech and privacy was really clearly explained, again, by the respondents to say that age verification technology has now advanced in a way that this can be done very quickly, conveniently to adults, and anonymously. And they also the respondents, Texas, continue to reiterate that this is not a ban on this content. It is not infringing on adults' rights to access this speech. It is just putting a hurdle in place that's actually an effective hurdle for keeping kids from these websites and an easy hurdle for adults to jump over in a process that takes about 45 seconds. And Justice Thomas, in the opinion, really clearly went after these points that the privacy concerns are really unfounded, that adults, we accept age verification in all these other facets of our lives, in brick and mortar stores, even online for gambling, purchasing alcohol. And so basically the Supreme Court found that in the favor of Texas, that this law was constitutional, and importantly, it applied intermediate scrutiny, not strict. And that was what the petitioners, the Free Speech Coalition, was really arguing for strict scrutiny, because it's a very difficult hurdle for laws to overcome, to pass strict scrutiny. You have to prove it's the least restrictive means, which is very difficult to do. And Justice Thomas clearly in the opinion said, no, states need to have more nuance for balancing the free speech rights of adults and their compelling interest in protecting children. And so intermediate scrutiny is the correct scrutiny, and this law clearly satisfies that. So it's a huge win, not just for this Texas law, but for any age verification laws going forward, to say intermediate scrutiny should apply. It gives states a lot more flexibility and latitude to regulate in this area, and it doesn't constrain them to one approach. The least restrictive means test is really difficult, because then any other law you pass, you're like, well, wait, which one is the least restrictive means?
Yeah.
And Justice Thomas even acknowledged in the opinion, states need not address every aspect of the problem in one law. And so he was saying, the least restrictive means test doesn't apply, intermediate scrutiny applies. And what that means is that actually now states can take lots of different angles to tackle this problem. Age verification being maybe the most prominent right now, but it doesn't then cut off other possible solutions they might explore legally. So it was a huge win. I'm very excited to see this opinion come out this way.
Yeah, it's been awesome to see. One thing that opponents will sometimes try to claim is that kids will just find some technical workaround, right? They'll use a VPN or do whatever, because kids have greater technical expertise than their parents, and they'll just do it anyway. Assuming like they're just adamant about accessing porn. But Claire, you mentioned some research in the book, in the tech exit, that sort of addresses that claim. And do you think that claim's founded? That kids are just going to do it anyway?
So I think it's really important, and this is what Justice Thomas also acknowledged in the opinion, that a law doesn't need to be perfect to shut down every possible point of access to be an effective law. And so this law places a very effective hurdle for kids that is difficult for them to prove or verify their age. I mean, they don't have identification. It's not easy to falsify a driver's license or something that shows they're an adult. So I actually think it is a very effective hurdle. The VPN argument gets used a lot. I think it's kind of a red herring, because what people don't realize is there's no exception in these laws that says, oh, well, if a child used a VPN to access your website, then you're off the hook for legal liability. So what that means is, in practice, websites, if a user is coming to them via a VPN, should still age verify that user. If they're not sure what geographic location they're coming to them from, whether or not they're in one of these states that has a law, it is in their legal interest, now knowing that they are accountable if minors are able to access their content, if they're not age verified, to verify users coming to them via VPN. So there's no VPN exception in the law. And so even if a child were to use that, really the websites, it's on them to be verifying age, even if a user is coming via VPN. So I do think that it is a very effective hurdle that is difficult for children to get over. And the other important piece to recognize is this really prevents a lot of accidental exposure. And I think that's what people don't necessarily realize, is that most children don't start out looking for pornography. They stumble across it on social media, they click on a link without realizing what it is, and because there's no age gate, they're immediately barraged with this obscene content on these pornography websites. One survey found that 58% of teens had encountered pornography accidentally, most through an online means. And so these laws are critical in preventing that type of accidental exposure to some of the worst obscene content on the internet, on these websites.
I really thought that part of the book was really compelling, where you talk about, it's not just this kid who's trying to get around mom and dad's rules.
That's right.
It's kids who are kind of assaulted by this omnipresent, these access points online wherever they go
Yes.
without even knowing what they're necessarily getting into at first.
And that exposure is really dangerous because now the pornography websites have adopted the same kind of model as social media with these very aggressive algorithms. And so a kid accidentally clicks on a link and then all of a sudden they're sucked down extremely dangerous rabbit holes where it just continues to feed them more and more of that content. And so I feel for parents too who are doing everything right. They've installed all the filters, they've set up all the parental controls, but without age restricting these websites, and the fact that filters often can't work inside of social media apps means that a child could actually click through to Pornhub inside of Snapchat in just 5 clicks without ever leaving the app.
Yeah.
And a filter can't block that. A parent wouldn't know. But with these age verification laws, if they click on that link to Pornhub inside of Snapchat, they're blocked. They have to actually prove they're an adult to get through to that content. And it provides a collective solution where if my child is on the school bus and another child is trying to pull up a pornography website on their phone, they actually can't do that because they can't get through. And I think that's the problem is parents have been trying to effectively shut down every possible portal of entry to these pornography websites, which is impossible.
Right.
And we don't accept that in the real world. I try to make the analogy, parents aren't running around town trying to prevent every store from selling their child alcohol or tobacco or a pornographic magazine. The stores are ensuring that those are sold only to adults, and it should be the same for the online world. And that was made over and over in the arguments that we have to have a constitutional regime that is as close as possible to the real world in the virtual world. There shouldn't be a great disparity between these two places.
Yeah, it's not controversial in the real world.
No,
like
not
say.
at all. Yeah.
So Father Hoffa, in your pastoral experience, have you talked to people whose kind of early exposure to pornography was kind of this accidental way, or were the vast majority of people sort of intentionally seeking it out? Like what, with the people you've worked with, how intentional was it?
It happens in all different ways, and it's morphing as we go along, because now one of the things that you're fighting is, like Claire mentioned, the algorithms that also come up and that are learning what you're doing. And it's so interesting is hearing the different things that came up with this Paxton case. One of the things we know about the pornography industry, $100 billion grossing industry worldwide per year. Like money we can't even fathom. Yeah. And what that does is that provides them the legal backing, that provides them the lobby. For instance, it was so great when they brought out about the fact that the Free Speech Coalition is this particular lobby just for the porn industry. Yeah. That needs to be made known, because so many times, again, you hear in movies, things, shell companies and stuff like that. Well, there's these shell lobbies that are out there to be able to do that. Yeah. But then when you get down to what they also are able to reinvest that money in is almost a marketing plan. And that marketing plan is vast. The clickbait, that does not only affect the young, but also a group that I've now become very focused on, almost in a way of how all of what we've done with youth protection and things, we're also talking now about vulnerable older adults.
Right.
Because that is a whole nother section of people with the clickbait that are falling vulnerable to this because they're not prepared, because they grew up in a culture not to be on guard against this, and not the first click, but maybe 5 clicks down the road, you're immersed in this. So when I work with people who are struggling with porn addiction and porn use struggles, habits, one of the things that we see is they get into their ritual and their routine. And going back to what Claire was mentioning about kids, going and the laws, Free Speech Coalition was saying, oh well, they're just going to go and use a VPN or a way to find around it. Once you put up those barriers, it's going to halt them, and they're going to look for something else that is easy to access. Yes. Whether they're going to go and look at a YouTube video that isn't pornographic in nature, but they're going to say, oh, I don't want to have to waste all this time on this. So it is going to be a deterrent, because when you talk about that ritual, it's one thing leads into another. Like she was saying, using Snapchat as a portal to Pornhub. When that pops up and you say, well, I'm not interested in spending the time of having to do this work run, I'm just going to go do something else that entertains me. And that is making a huge difference. But you have people who their exposure to pornography, some of it is out of curiosity. And so that's why when I go out and talk with parent groups and things like that, I talk to them. I was just having this conversation the other day where someone was talking about their parents' very lackluster attempt at the birds and the bees talk. Yeah. And I said to them, listen, it's no longer about a talk. It needs to be a conversation that needs to be age appropriate from the time that child starts viewing technology, visual things, because it's all out there in all different types of ways, and how that works into a child's life over the course of their maturation as a minor really does make a difference. And so the ability to temper, as Clare's book lays out, their access to technology, but also then to understand that, yes, this will have what we believe in, the church in terms of that human integration of human sexuality and how important that is to take course properly over the course of time. So crucial. So for some, they come upon it accidentally. For some, it's curiosity. For some, it's introduced. And then we get into also the trauma effects of this with stunted sexual development because of it was forced upon them. They weren't even open to a curiosity, but someone put it in their face, or the algorithms, the things, it popped right in their face. They weren't even going to look for something along those lines, and now it's caused damage. So when in my work that I do with Integrity Restored, and I get a lot of referrals, a lot of times I find myself in the situation of triage. And so I get that first story of a person coming and saying, and I ask, what was your time of first exposure? Things like frequency. And with working with priests, a lot of times we're on the front lines because in the confessional, that's usually the first place where people come and they're like, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I viewed pornography. And we help priests through the work that we do at Integrity Restored to help them train to understand what are those quick first questions that you can get a person thinking about in the confessional that can guide them into a discussion, into pastoral counseling, into just the office, or to refer them to someone like me. We do that triage. We understand what was the nature of that exposure, what's been the nature of the timeline. Then we can start to direct them to the resources, whether it be a clinician, whether there is just some simple helps that they need. And a lot of times it comes back to that whole thing of ritual, which for a child getting into that ritual, a lot of it comes down to effort, because again, kids want to be entertained. So if they find that block that's popping up on that website, they're going to say, you know what, it's not worth my time. I'm going to go look at something else. So what the Supreme Court was able to uphold and now is going to, and more states are catching on to this. FSC went after Paxton and the state of Texas, but there are other states who are also putting in these laws. And if you remember, I forget how many years ago it was, but it was basic. I don't know if it was Florida or who, but they called out Pornhub because Pornhub was getting sloppy in the fact that they were putting out child porn in their distributed porn. And they're like, what's going on here? Well, they don't care because they're just making money off of it. And so finally they called them on it and said, you have to monitor your stuff. And now this is all poured out into this whole thing. We need to be a lot more protective because the industry doesn't care. All they're looking for is people to come and follow along and be sort of their brainless, mindless, subjects of following this, and it's causing so much damage. So it's so great that we're having conversations like this, that Clare is doing the work that she's doing, that it's coming into law now to be that everybody's looking at this and saying it needs to stop. We would say for everyone, but we're starting with the one of the most vulnerable groups, which is our children.
Yeah. When we were talking about this last week, I was thinking, it got me thinking, you told me a story about Ireland, and it got me thinking about what might have happened if this case had been decided differently. And when we talked, we didn't even know how the case was going to be decided. So there was a chance of that happening. If the Supreme Court had decided differently, and if they had overturned the Texas age verification law, how do you think that would have developed after that?
Well, I think you make reference to back a number of years ago, maybe 2 or 3, I was contacted by a woman named Patricia Keane, who was on Radio Maria Ireland with the Health Matters program over in Ireland. And basically, we have governmental agencies like Health and Human Services and other things. Other countries don't have those large entities that help to regulate different things of that nature. So over in Ireland and other countries, they look to worldwide organizations like the WHO. And if you want to read something scary, go and look at what the WHO recommends in their matrix for by different age groups of how they should come to an understanding of their human sexuality. It's very, very scary, and it's completely opposed to what we would say within our Catholic moral teaching. But one of the things that they're doing over there is that they're using pornography and telling minors that they can use it responsibly as a means to instruct themselves about their human sexuality. And it's completely ridiculous, because what you're doing is, we think of, you hear an ad today about a drug that you would take, a medicine, and all of the harmful side effects. And sometimes the side effects seem to outweigh the goods of the medication that's being advertised.
Right.
But they're saying, oh, we think that this is going to help you to understand more about your body. But by the way, we're not even considering all of the harmful effects that this is going to have on you, on your relationships, on all of these different things. So they had me over. We recorded through Shalom World TV this series called The Porn Disaster that focused on just all of these harmful effects, and the ball continues to roll. As we were prepping for this, we were talking about people like Matt Fradd with Pints with Aquinas, and different things that he's doing. And there's so many different people. We work with Covenant Eyes and Fight the New Drug. And the list goes on. Defend Young Minds, which is a great organization out there, especially focused on our young people. So more and more people are stepping up, but now that we can have the law behind this is great. But had this been different, it would be really scary, because again, $100 billion, there's a lot of money to reinvest in the marketing, in the pervasiveness of all of this. And now, and I'm sure we're going to get into this, the next wave of what we have to prevent against is all of the ways AI can be used. It can be used for good, but it can also be used in a perverse way for things that can be completely destructive. And the pornography industry is going to pick up on that big time.
That is definitely going to be the next step. Go ahead,
I was just
Claire.
going to jump in on that and say, you mentioned more states than Texas have passed these laws. 24 states have now passed age verification laws. I mean, that's almost half the country that have these laws. And so this is a win, not just for Texas, but for all those other states too, because they may be in current legal challenges, and now they can point to the Supreme Court precedent to basically show that their laws are also constitutional. They're all written very similarly.
Do you expect more states to follow suit now that the Supreme Court has weighed in?
I do. I actually think some states who are maybe a little more cautious were kind of waiting to see how the Supreme Court would come down.
Yeah.
And the decision could not have been written more clearly or strongly to protect states' power to regulate online obscenity access for children in this way, to really give them a very clear constitutional footing for this. And I hope that this also leads Congress to pass a nationwide age verification law. Like, it shouldn't depend on what state you live in. We should have protection for all of America's children. All parents need this backup. And you were imagining the future without these laws. I think it would just default to the lowest common denominator. I think that's what we see is in an age of smartphones and social media, even if every parent is doing their best to protect their family, if any child has access to a smartphone with access to pornography websites, then the moral standards for the community default to the lowest common denominator. Yeah. And so I talk about this a lot in the book, that it's a both and. Parents will always be on the front lines. We always have to be doing everything we can to protect and prepare our own children. I appreciate what you said about having those conversations early and often in this internet era. It's very important. So protect and prepare, but we also need the law to back parents up. When something rises to a collective harm, we need the government to step in, and that's what states are doing. And I'm hopeful Congress will follow their lead and pass this nationwide.
Yeah. I think the other thing that goes along with that is, and continuing with that whole thing, the USCCB is here in Washington and, works with the lobby on the federal level. But then you have the Catholic conferences of states, that are working with the state legislatures. And, I'm in Pennsylvania. And so in talking with the folks at the Pennsylvania Catholic Conference, they saw prior to this, and I haven't had a chance to talk to them since the decision, but they saw this as a slow building process where you have to take it piece by piece, and then you can take the next step. But this precedent now at the Supreme Court level is going to be huge, because now there can be a bigger push to say, okay, we can rely on what the Supreme Court has said and see all these other states. So I could see maybe next 3 years in and around there as the average, that we're going to get to 3/4 of the country, and even closer to 100%. But I agree with Claire, if the federal government, if Congress can come and make this a priority to be able to help our young people. One of the things that we found is there are so many other overarching issues that we are concerned about as Americans, as human beings, that are connected to this issue. The institution of the family, human trafficking, and the list goes on and on of the things that are birth rates. All of these things are connected to this issue of pornography that is infiltrating. It's not the sole issue, but it is one of the largest. But it's also one of the things that people have habitually not wanted to talk about because it regards sex and sexuality. But this is where the church has a joy-filled message, a hope-filled message that always comes back to exactly what we're talking about, which is love. And at the core of it, we want people to understand its fullness, that this isn't a wagging prohibitive finger that's waving from the church, but rather, as when I go out, I say we always strike the balance. We're against the bad, but we're also about the good. And so there is the bad of pornography, but here's why we don't want you invested in that bad, because there is a much better life that is porn-free for our young people all the way to the eldest among us and everyone in between, for every vocation and every lifestyle that's out there.
So true.
I think one of the coolest things that has resulted from some of these state laws is that the harmful websites, instead of just complying with the age verification law, they've chosen to just shut down operations altogether in those states for all users, regardless of age.
Victory.
Which, which tells you something about their prioritization of minors as part of their customer base.
Totally.
And you mentioned that over 20 states have passed these laws so far, and in most of those states, Pornhub and similar sites have shut down.
Yes, I think 17 states Pornhub just left completely.
Yeah. And that may be increasing with Georgia law taking effect soon. And I wonder about the kind of national side and our ability to protect families and safeguard the good, because there was an American Principles Project poll about this issue, about the possibility of a national age verification law. And they polled something like 1,000 American adults about this, and 83% of them were in favor of a national law like what we're talking about. And I think for a lot of people, especially parents, like, the problem can be a little abstract, and maybe they're against it in general, but they don't know what to do on like an individual level. They kind of feel powerless. So Father Hoffa, let's start to talk about more the individual level a little bit. Let's shift gears. And let's take an example of a guy who maybe goes to Mass a few times a year, wouldn't describe himself as an active Catholic, but he struggles with pornography, and he does want to get help for this because he feels like it's an addiction. I mean, obviously we would agree that it's an addiction, but even he, who's not necessarily paying close attention to church teaching, even he feels like it's an addiction, but he doesn't know where to start. If a guy like that wanted to get help, how would he go about reaching out to a parish priest, or would that even be the best place for somebody like him to start?
Yeah. So I think that the one thing is resources are continuing to abound that are out there. So integrityrestored.com, as you had mentioned in my bio, even as a diocese, we have the Lumen Christi Commission, adlumenchristi.com, that there more and more places are offering these resources that for a person who isn't ready to voice to another person yet, what they're thinking or feeling, resources are out there. But then, again, as the church, one of the common places where it comes up is in confession. And so when Integrity Restored first started, we went out and did in-person clergy training intensives that was to equip priests with the knowledge that they needed to be able to address this by giving them a more in-depth understanding, but not at the highest level that they're now becoming therapists and clinicians. And that's our balance, because we use the sacraments, spirituality, we use science, the psychology, the neurobiology, and also the focus of relationships and accountability. So what we found, especially through COVID, was, and with our priests being so busy, we needed to bring these intensives to the priests because they're going to be on the front lines. So we developed a 3 Pillars to Purity program. So that's an asynchronous. We learned all about asynchronous through COVID and the benefits of it, sometimes to people's chagrin, but we've put it out there so that priests can have this training so that they can understand and they can be in that role of sort of the triage nurse, that you're going to be that person. And I always say to priests, a lot of times you can hear in a person's voice when they come, the person who is just quick rushing through and they're either sort of glazing over and not being specific by naming the sin of pornography or masturbation connected with pornography. They're sort of glazing, I've committed an act against the sixth commandment, which is a huge range of what that might be. But then you get that person who you hear in their voice, Father, I need to do something.
Yeah.
And that becomes a moment of grace, a moment of hope, and a moment of help. And so our clergy are a big part in this, but then also church organizations and things like that. But the other piece where we went with this is we want people to be proactive, because again, this is still a reactive. We're talking about, yes, we need to respond to the people who are already hooked, but we also need to do the work as church to make sure that people aren't getting hooked. And it starts with our young.
Yeah.
And so I go out to schools, I talk to educators, anybody who will have me, and I go out. My cell phone is all over the world because people call at all random hours. They're like, "Is this Father Hoffa?" Yes. Can you help me? Is there a porn issue? Yes. Okay. So and we help them. But the big thing is getting people educated. So that goes back to when we spoke about the whole thing of the birds and the bees. Has to be done. And we have such a gift. John Paul II gave us the beautiful gift of the theology of the body. And what it called us to was an understanding of human anthropology, how we were made, what we were made for, and how that's supposed to live in relationship, and also just we ourselves, the respect of that, the fact that we're made in the image and likeness of God, how it was meant from the beginning, and how it's supposed to be lived out. And I think that one of the big pieces of all of that is what we were able to do in our parishes through catechesis, what we were able to do in preaching, what we were able to do in our schools and religious education programs, youth ministries, all over. And that is there as a gift to be able to help instruct our young that you have value, you have worth, and it's meant to be protected. Yeah. And so parents, don't allow the internet to raise your children.
No.
Don't think that the internet is going to raise your children to understand the gift of their human sexuality. I had a couple once, and in doing their marriage preparation, in the one inventory, they checked off that they thought pornography was okay in marriage. And this is a couple who had freely expressed that they were remaining chaste, they were waiting for marriage, and all of this. And I was just boggled by this. So I sat them down and I said, what's going on here? And they said, well, how else are we going to know how to have good sex with one another? And my mind was blown. I'm like, okay, so you guys have been faithful. This has been told to you, but you're really not understanding the underpinnings here, especially functionality, because animals can figure it out. We have rational brains and we can think much higher than that. So you'll be fine. Trust me. Yeah. And it comes back to love. And what that really means. And we have lived in a society for too long where use has been cloaked in that it's actually love, and it's not. And so the porn industry is using everyone. We, as a culture, at times, we're using each other. We need to get back to those foundations of love that we were created by love himself, in love, for love, to give and receive love. That's what it's all about. And so it's great that we're talking about this in the context of love, because if people really want to experience that authentically, then these things that are completely against it, we need to work hard to make sure that from the youngest among us, they're understanding as they grow up what love really looks like, what love really means. And that is portrayed in the constitution of the family. That's in the individual person, how we live out our masculinity, our femininity, and all of the things that the church has believed in for so long. But here's the thing, and this is where we're called to as church. We need to be ardent defenders and promoters of that truth, because I think that, let's face it, because of things like clergy sexual abuse and things like that, the devil used that to be able to silence the church on the good news. We have good news. We know that there are things that have happened in the past that are not good, that are sinful, and all of those things, reality. But that is not a cause for us to be silent about the things that is going to save lives, marriages, and souls.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that it's so hard for people to want to talk about this and to get as fired up and passionate and speak as articulately as you can about this. And we need more people who can do that, especially in local communities and in parishes. I'm thinking about another example. Maybe there's another guy who's also not very active, and who doesn't even necessarily want to get help for this, but who has maybe disclosed to a family member or a friend that he watches pornography and maybe doesn't see anything wrong with it. How can that friend or family member who wants to help kind of take the first step in offering him help in a way that he's maybe more likely to accept instead of turn his nose up at?
Yeah. You know, one of the big things when we talk about addiction or use disorder, you know, as they go through like 12-step programs and stuff, the person themselves has to want the help.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I always tell people is the first thing to present to the person is how they've changed. Because again, this stuff doesn't just, it's not about an outward action, but again, we look at the neurobiology of this, the chemicals in the brain, dopamine, oxytocin, you know, the clinicians can go deep into this. The neurobiologists can go deep into this about how it affects a person, but then their affect is changed too. Yeah. So we see people drawing away, becoming more insular, you know, not being relational. So as a family member, it is really good for you to be able to say, this is how I've seen you change, and it's happened over the course of time. And it's going at it, you know, non-threatening way, but what do you think has changed about you? But it's one of those things where to sort of have in your quiver of things that you can bring to the person to say, you know, like, is it anything that's happened traumatic, or, you know, and to know that things like, you know, pornography and things like that, especially depending if it started when you were young, that can have a trauma result that you don't even understand. Yeah. So I think that is definitely one of the big pieces that you're introducing to the person is, you know, you've changed in all of this, and I care about you. The other thing that's really neat is that there are different groups that are coming up to help people do that. And over at Fight the New Drug, they have a really great documentary series that's called Brain Heart World that's really good. And also they have this thing called the Blueprint. And basically it's a step-by-step. So you go on and you hit the blueprint, and you're a person who wants to address another person and their porn use. And so you pick, is it my friend? Is it my family member, child, parent, spouse? And you click on that, then they ask you another qualifying question. And then it sort of breaks it down to say, hey, here are some things that you can, you know, ask that person or help that person. So every person's different. And the other thing too is that I've had plenty of people who have come to me saying, hey, can you help me talk to this person? I don't feel that I'm equipped. I don't feel that I have the tools. I would rather, you know, that our parish priest be there, or you're just a random priest, you know, the priest who deals with everybody's porn issues, you know, that type of thing. And I'm happy to, you know, again, the blessing is that with technology, and now we know how to use Zoom and Teams and FaceTime and all those things, especially because of COVID, we can go wherever we need to around the world to be able to help people. And I think that that's a blessing. But it all goes back to, you need to introduce the problem for the person to even realize that there might be one.
Yeah.
And so the ability to bring that up, even just in the conversation of saying, hey, I heard this awesome podcast, or I watched this awesome video for the USCCB and their Love Means More program, or I saw this fact, like following these different entities on social media. They do a great job of just putting out the different factoids and stuff like that. I'm sure once everybody's had a chance to dive into this Paxton case, there's going to be great things that are going to come out from that as well. So it just continues to build upon itself. We're definitely, and I think that also speaks to, Andrew, the USCCB's great wisdom in having this 10th anniversary reboot of what was to create me a clean heart, now a pure heart, is the fact that the landscape has changed in the last 10 years.
Yes.
And the landscape's going to be different in the next 10 years for the 20th anniversary. But my hope is that what we're going to be able to show then is a lot more of the longitudinal data that shows the harmful effects, but also how the church and other people of goodwill, you know, in the world are also responding to this issue, and the increased resources that are out there to be able to help people in every situation, but in the one that you spoke about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you've summed up a lot really, really helpfully. You know, I wonder what next steps people can take in light of this decision, in light of what we talked about, in light of the 10th anniversary document, in light of all this. Like, what can parents do going forward that sort of builds on this?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, in response to some of the things that Father Hoffa was sharing, that the number one message I would just really want to convey to parents is that to delay smartphones and social media as long as possible. I mean, that is the message of the tech exit. And it's for more reasons than just pornography exposure. The dopamine effects that Father Hoffa was talking about from pornography are also true for social media and smartphones. And that children having access to this incredibly powerful technology is extremely addictive to their brains. It actually harms their brain development. But then also the exposure to dangerous things like pornography, like predators and bad actors, is just, it's impossible to effectively lock down a smartphone to be safe for a child or a teen. And so talking about hope, the message that my book, The Tech Exit, holds out is actually one of hope. I think parents have felt like smartphones are now just an inevitable part of childhood. And the book just says, no, it actually doesn't have to be that way. And so it's both the argument for like why a smartphone-free childhood is necessary, but also the exact practical steps to take as a parent to have that be possible for your family. And so, yeah, I don't know if you have anything. I could keep talking about the book, but I do think that parents have actually been sold a myth by the tech companies that, oh, your kids can use our products, just put screen time limits and parental controls in place. And parents will tell you anecdotally that is not working out. And I can tell you from all my research that kids are not being effectively protected with those strategies, and that what really is necessary is completely pushing smartphones out of childhood and the teen years as far and as long as possible, and that it's actually possible to do this. And so many families are doing this. Like, I think people think, oh, I'll be the only one. It's a growing movement of parents that are resisting these devices for our kids.
I'm so glad that I didn't have this growing up, that I didn't have a smartphone growing up, because it's bad enough for me as it is.
Oh, they're addicting for adults.
The dopamine hits are hitting everybody.
Yeah.
And if I was growing up with it, it would have been so much worse. And I've never, ever talked to anybody who says the opposite.
That's right.
That they wish they had a smartphone growing up when they didn't.
No.
Nobody says that.
No.
Right?
And you were talking about habits, and I think that's what's so important is that children are forming like their key life habits ages 0 to 18, and we want them to form them free of pornography, free of smartphones and addictive technologies that really can really like basically burden them with lifelong addictions that they're fighting, because their brains are so plastic as young kids. Yeah. They're changing, and you want them to develop in a healthy way and to not become so hardwired towards things that are really addictive. And I'll also just say it's never too late to reverse course. I talk to parents all the time that say, oh, I wish I had read your book a year ago. Like, we already gave our 14-year-old a smartphone. And I'm like, no, this is exactly why you need to read the book, because the book walks you through how to detox from these things if you've already given them. That it is a message of hope. It's never too late to reverse course. Even for a teen with a smartphone, it's not too late to give your child a gift of an in-person childhood. And I really emphasize that saying no to the screens is saying yes to so much more in real life. We don't want our kids to be trained their tastes toward these cheap digital substitutes. We want them to want the real thing, real life friendship, love, happiness in the real world. And that's the message of the book.
We want them to touch grass, yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, and I think one of the big things that goes along with that is the fact of when we're talking about the need for relationship, it's person to person.
Yes.
But when you're giving that child that reliance on that phone, you're saying your relational fulfillment can come from this device. No, it can't. And so the porn is almost being set up because of the early introduction to the phone. And when I go out and talk to parent groups, I tell them, listen, do not take this as anti-tech, all of these things, but it's about moderation and balance. I say think about like when I was growing up, I'm 42 years old. When I was growing up and, you went through the store, if you heard a baby crying, they were given a pacifier or maybe a little toy that they could play with while, the shopping was done and stuff like that. Now, phone, tablet, again, a lot of them without the parental restrictions, but then also with that, just that, again, it's become such a part of their life. Yeah. And I think that it's one of those things of when it does get then introduced later on, it needs to be with proper limits, because again, we have tools that can be used for good, just like the internet, just like social media, it can be used for good. But then we also know that those things in a fallen world can be warped into being used for something bad. And the good thing is that we are learning, but we need to talk about the process of learning about these things quicker. So for instance, we're talking about, these 24 states that have put in these age restriction laws for pornography. But the other thing that's on the rise is that these states that are coming across with keeping phones out of schools, because they're seeing the learning growth is being stunted because these kids are so connected to their phones. And again, it's not that technology can't be, but there's a lot of school systems that went all to technology and got rid of pen and paper learning. There needs to be a balance, and I think that that's one of the things. I remember being in seminary, and they would say, good Catholic theology is both and, not either or. It's not one or the other, but there needs to be moderation, and that moderation needs to start at an appropriate age. Definitely not when these children are young, that they're learning relationship from a device. They need to learn relationship from people, and then that also leads them to a relationship with Christ.
Yes, that's huge. The no smartphones in schools thing is an unbelievable benefit that kids even welcome.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I talk about that in the book as well. Like, it has been just an amazing solution because it not only protects their academic environment, but it's the social environment. It's that collective solution so that they can actually build those in-life friendships during lunch, during their passing periods, instead of all being staring down siloed on their own screens.
And it makes it so much easier for parents who
individually
want to protect their kids.
Yes.
Right? Because so much of the challenge comes from the kids' friends.
Yes.
All my friends have smartphones.
That's right.
It's not fair for me to
You can
not
at least keep the school day free of the smartphones.
Yeah.
It's incredibly powerful.
And I think the one thing too is to look at the bigger issue with it also, that again, people don't play out the effects of this. So one of the things that you'll hear some parents make the fight on is, because of this age where we've had school violence and different things, I want my child to have their phone on them. But let's look at the stats. The likelihood of that happening to your child versus all of the harmful effects of that phone in your child's life because of not only the porn industry, but again, all of that just stunting of relational development and stuff like that. We are sending out more and more children who are relationally love stunted, all of these things, and who have never experienced any type of violence, in school. No. The violence they have experienced, though, is the violence that's on that phone. And I'm not talking about videos of violence. I'm talking about how the phone and technology that is unregulated and is not introduced properly is taking violence on the brain and on the heart. And so that's where people need to take a step back and say, we can't go and try to proactively to an extreme prevent one problem when we're introducing a whole host of other problems that are really more detrimental to our child's development.
And school safety experts say that's a complete myth. Like, kids are actually safer not having individual phones on them in an incident. Like, first responders will say kids are safer without access to the phones.
Kind of the best of both worlds, not having a phone in school.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to wrap up for now. This is not the end of our conversation. As a follow-up to this episode, we'll be having a live Q&A with Clare and Father Hoffa over Zoom on July 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern, so you can register at the link in the description. The description also has links to Creating Me a Pure Heart, Clare's new book, The Tech Exit, and the Integrity Restored Ministry, where Father Hoffa helps people recover from pornography addiction, plus much more. Please be sure to share this video with friends, like and subscribe. You know the drill. Bye now, and God love you.